The courtroom fell silent, everyone's breath caught in their throats as they watched in disbelief. No one had ever seen such disrespect before. Mr. Richard Thornton, a high-powered businessman, with a smug grin, stood tall. In his expensive navy blue suit, he leaned back, crossing his arms, as he smirked at the woman sitting on the judge's bench. Judge Evelyn Carter remained calm, her face unreadable, but the tension in the room was thick as smoke. "This is a joke, right?" Richard scoffed. "I don't take orders from women. I built a billion-dollar empire. Who are you to tell me what to do?" Gasps filled the room. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. The courtroom guards stiffened. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. But Judge Carter didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked onto Richard, her expression unreadable. A pause, a silence so heavy it felt like time had stopped. Then, in a slow, measured voice, Judge Carter finally spoke. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your words, because if you don't, what happens next will be entirely on you." Richard scoffed again, rolling his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, and that's when it happened. A sound echoed through the courtroom. A door creaked open. At the back, a shadow appeared, stepping forward with purpose. The color drained from Richard's face. The entire courtroom turned, their eyes widening in horror. What they saw next, no one would have believed it 2 weeks earlier. Richard Thornton had everything a man could want: wealth, power, and the respect, or rather fear, of his employees. His name was spoken in hushed whispers in boardrooms. He was the CEO of Thornton Industries, a corporation that crushed competitors without mercy. His towering office in downtown Manhattan had floored his ceiling windows, giving him a view of the city. He practically ruled. He always said that rules were for the weak. That's why he bent them, broke them, and rewrote them to fit his needs. On this particular morning, Richard sat at his desk, scrolling through his emails. His assistant Daniel, a timid young man in his late 20s, knocked on the door. "Sir," Daniel said, nervously holding a file about the court hearing today. Richard sighed, barely looking up. "What hearing?" "The lawsuit." "So the employee who filed against U.S. Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, that nonsense. Listen, Danny boy, I don't lose cases ever. I have the best lawyers money can buy." He smirked. "Besides, some soft-hearted judge isn't going to scare me." Daniel swallowed. "Actually, sir, the judge is." Richard cut him off. "I don't care who she is. We'll crush this case like all the others." Daniel hesitated, but Richard shot him a glare. "What?" Daniel cleared his throat. "The judge is Evelyn Carter." At that name, Richard finally looked up. His smirk faltered. Just for a second, Judge Carter had a reputation. She was known for being tough, unshakable, and worst of all, completely immune to bribes. She had taken down corrupt CEOs, crooked politicians, and untouchable criminals. Richard leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "Carter, how woman." He shook his head. "This should be fun." Daniel face tense. "Sir, I really think we should be careful." Richard stood abruptly. "Enough, get my car ready. I'll handle this myself." As he grabbed his coat, he grinned. "No judge has ever beaten me," he muttered. "And that's not going to change today." An hour or later, Richard strutted into the courthouse like he owned the place. Cameras flashed. Reporters called his name, desperate for a statement. "Mr. Thornton, do you have anything to say about the allegations? Are you worried about facing Judge Carter? Do you think justice will be served today?" Richard smirked, but said nothing. Instead, he walked straight past them. His lawyers struggling to keep up. The courtroom doors swung open, and Richard stepped inside. And there, she was. Judge Evelyn Carter sat at the bench, her presence commanding the room. Without a single word, her sharp eyes locked onto Richard as he approached. He expected a frail woman, someone easily intimidated. Instead, he found someone who radiated quiet strength. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt something strange doubt. But he pushed it away. He was Richard Thornton. He didn't lose. As he took his seat, he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "Watch me put this woman in her place." His lawyer winced, but said nothing. The BFF called the court to order. The trial began. At first, Richard played along. He smirked when the plaintiff's lawyer spoke. He even pretended to listen when Judge Carter addressed the court. But then something shifted. Judge Carter wasn't like the other judges he had faced. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth. She wasn't charmed by his fake smiles. And worst of all, she was good. Every time he tried to deflect, she shut him down. Every time he dodged a question, she redirected it. And that's when Richard lost control. His arrogance got the best of him. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and with a smirk, uttered the words that would haunt him forever. "This is a joke, right?" he said, his voice loud and dismissive. "I don't take orders from women." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Carter's eyes darkened. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The audience murmured in disbelief. Richard didn't care. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I built a billion-dollar empire. Who are you to tell me what to do? And then just as he thought he had the upper hand, a sound echoed through the courtroom. A door creaked open at the back. A shadow appeared, stepping forward with purpose. The color drained from Richard's face. The entire courtroom turned, their eyes widening in horror. What they saw next, no one would have believed it. Richard's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The air in the courtroom felt thick, suffocating. He swallowed hard. As the shadow moved closer, stepping into the dim light, gasps rippled through the crowd. The reporters stopped scribbling. The jury sat frozen, their eyes locked on the figure approaching the bench. Judge Evelyn Carter remained still, her expression unreadable, but her fingers slowly tapped against the desk. Richard felt his mouth go dry. He knew that face. He knew exactly who it was. And suddenly, for the first time in his life, Richard Thornton was afraid. 2 weeks earlier, Richard had never cared about other people's problems. He built his empire on ruthless ambition, crushing anyone who stood in his way. His company, Thornton Industries, controlled everything from real estate to pharmaceuticals. He was untouchable, and he knew it. But there was one thing he didn't know: his actions had consequences. One evening, Richard sat in the back of his luxury car, sipping a glass of whiskey. The city lights blurred past as he scrolled through his phone, checking stock prices. His driver, an older man named Walter, cleared his throat. "Sir, what be arriving at the office in 10 minutes. Richard didn't look up. "Fine." Walter hesitated. "Sir, if I may." Richard sighed, annoyed. What? Walter swallowed hard. "It's about the lawsuit." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "Not you too, Walter. That case is nothing." "But, sir," Richard snapped, "enough. I don't pay you to question me." Walter's grip on the wheel tightened, but he said nothing. Richard smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Some people just can't handle the real world. They cry unfair when they lose. That's what this lawsuit is, a waste of time." Walter didn't respond, and that was Richard's first mistake, because sometimes silence is more dangerous than words. The next morning, Richard stormed into his office, his face red with anger. "Where's Daniel?" he barked. His assistant appeared instantly, holding a tablet. "Yes, sir." Richard snatched it from his hands. "The media is tearing me apart over this lawsuit. Why haven't we shut this down yet?" Daniel shifted nervously. "Sir, it's not that simple. The judge handling this case." "I don't care about the judge." Richard threw the tablet onto his desk. "We pay people to make these things disappear." "Make it disappear?" Daniel hesitated. "Sir, it's Judge Evelyn Carter." Richard smirked, faltered. "So sheck known for being." Daniel searched for the right word. "Incorruptible." Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. "No one's incorruptible." Daniel glanced away. "She is." Richard waved him off. "She's just another name on a list. We've won against bigger threats." But deep down, something didn't feel right. For the first time, Richard had an opponent he couldn't control. The trial day arrived. Richard entered the courtroom confident as ever. His navy blue suit was crisp, his shoes polished to perfection. He owned the room. The moment he stepped inside, at least he thought he did, until he saw Judge Carter. She was different from any judge he had faced. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or his charm. She didn't flinch when he smirked, and the more she spoke, the more uneasy Richard felt. She saw through him, every lie, every excuse, every deflection. She shut it down with ease. Then came the moment he lost control. His arrogance got the best of him. "This is a joke, right?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "I don't take orders from women." The courtroom went silent. Richard smirked, thinking he had won. But then the door creaked open at the back. A shadow stepped forward, and as Richard turned, his face paled, because standing there in front of everyone was someone he never expected to see again. The entire courtroom turned toward the figure. Judge Carter's expression remained unreadable, but her gaze flickered just for a second toward the person who had just entered. The murmurs grew louder. Reporters whispered to each other. The jury shifted in their seats. Richard's stomach twisted into knots. His confidence wavered. The person standing before him had the power to ruin everything. He gripped the table, his knuckles turning white. "No," he muttered under his breath. "This can't be happening." The figure took another step forward, their voice clear and steady. "I think it's time the truth came out." Richard's world started to crumble, and what happened next would change everything. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears, his entire body tightened as he locked eyes with the figure standing at the back of the courtroom. A wave of gas spread through the crowd like wildfire. People whispered, pointed, and leaned forward in their seats, desperate to understand what was happening. Judge Carter sat unmoving, her eyes scanning Richard's face. She had expected this moment. She was waiting for it. Richard swallowed hard, but his throat felt dry like sandpaper. The person standing before him was Hannah Lawson, and she was the one person who could destroy him. 6 months earlier, Hannah Lawson had been one of the brightest employees at Thornton Industries. She was sharp, hard-working, and fiercely dedicated. For 5 years, she worked tirelessly, climbing the corporate ladder, believing that her talent and determination would earn her a well-deserved promotion. But she had made a grave mistake. She had trusted Richard Thornton. Hannah had uncovered something big, a fraud scheme buried deep in the company's financial records. Millions of dollars were being funneled through offshore accounts under fake names. Employees were unknowingly being used as pawns in illegal transactions. She had taken the information straight to Richard, expecting him to be furious that someone within the company was committing fraud. Instead, he had laughed. "Listen, sweetheart," Richard had said, leaning back in his chair, amused by her concerns. "This is business. Big money doesn't move without a little grease in the gears." Hannah had felt her stomach twist. "But this is illegal," Richard had shrugged. "Who's going to stop me?" Her blood had run cold. That was the moment she knew Richard Thornton wasn't just aware of the fraud. He was the fraud. "You need to fix this," she had demanded, gripping the folder of evidence. Richard had stood slowly, walking around his desk. His smirk never faded. "You think you're important, don't you?" he had murmured, stepping closer. "You think you matter." Hannah had taken a step back. Something in his eyes had made her uneasy. "You have two choices, Hannah," Richard had continued. "You can forget what you saw and keep your job," or he had plucked the folder from her hands, flipping through it lazily. "You can make this very hard for yourself." Her heart had pounded. "Are you threatening me?" Richard had leaned in, lowering his voice. "No," he had whispered, "I'm promising you." 2 days later, Hannah had been fired. No explanation, no severance pay. And just like that, her career was over. But Hannah hadn't disappeared. She had fought. She had gathered more evidence, filed a lawsuit, and refused to back down even when Richard's lawyers tried to bury her case. And now here she stood in this courtroom, ready to face the man who had tried to destroy her. Back in the courtroom, Richard's hands balled into fists. He wanted to deny everything, to call security, to make her leave. But he could not with the entire courtroom watching. Hannah took another step forward, her voice steady. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Carter, "I have evidence that will change everything." Richard's jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous. She's a disgruntled ex-employee. This is just a personal vendetta." Judge Carter held up a hand, silencing him. "Hannah Lawson," she said, turning her full attention to her, "you are aware that any false statements made in this courtroom come with legal consequences." Hannah nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor." Richard forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Come on, this is absurd." Judge Carter's sharp gaze turned to him. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you don't control this courtroom." The words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time, he wasn't the one in charge. Hannah walked toward the plaintiff's table and placed a thick folder of documents on the desk. "Your Honor," she said, "I have bank statements, offshore account details, and internal emails proving that Richard Thornton is responsible for millions of dollars in corporate fraud." Gasps filled the room. Reporters scrambled to write every word. The jury members exchanged shocked glances. Richard's face burned, turned hot, his vision blurred with rage. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years making sure no one could touch him. And now this woman, this nobody, was about to ruin everything. His pulse roared in his ears. His breathing was ragged. Then suddenly, bam, a loud bang rang through the courtroom. People screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor. Judge Carter stood sharply, her expression hardening. And Richard turned toward the sound just in time to see the courtroom doors slam shut. Something was very, very wrong. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the heavy doors slammed shut, sending an eerie boom echoing to the grand chamber. Judge Carter immediately straightened in her seat, her sharp gaze scanning the room's security. "What is going on?" The guards at the doors moved quickly, gripping the handles, but they wouldn't budge. Locked. Richard's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. Then a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "You think you can silence the truth, Richard?" Richard's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, eyes darting around the room, searching for the speaker. Hannah stood, frozen, confusion flickering in her eyes. The jury members murmured in nervous whispers. Reporters clutched their notebooks tighter. And then a figure stepped forward, a man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, and wearing a mask that covered the lower half of his face. The entire courtroom fell silent, the security guards' tined hands hovering over their radios. Judge Carter's expression remained unreadable, but her fingers curled into a fist. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The masked man took a step closer. "Someone who knows exactly what Richard Thornton is capable of." Richard felt something deep, something unfamiliar, fear. "I don't know who you are," he spat, standing abruptly, "but you're making a very big mistake." The man tilted his head. "Am I?" Judge Carter glanced at the security guards, who inched forward cautiously. "Sir, you need to remove yourself from this courtroom immediately," she ordered. The masked man chuckled and let Richard walk free. I don't think so. Richard clenched his jaw. This is ridiculous. You have no authority. Here the man reached into his coat. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in. The jury let out a small scream. One of the security guards shouted, "Sir, hands where we can see them now." The man froze slowly. He pulled something from his coat, a USB drive. Richard exhaled sharply, but his body was still tense. The man held up the tiny device between his fingers. "Everything you've done, Richard, everything you've buried." His voice was sharp and steady. "It's all in here." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard felt his control slipping. Judge Carter motioned for the security guard to take the USB. The guard cautiously approached, snatched the device, and handed it to the court clerk. Judge Carter turned to the masked man. "What exactly is on this drive?" The man exhaled. "Proof." Richard slammed his hands on the table. "This is absurd. You're just some lunatic off the street." The man turned to face him. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Richard hesitated. Something about the voice, the eyes, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. Judge Carter gestured toward the security guards. "Remove his mask." The guards stepped forward, their hands firm. The man didn't resist. With one swift motion, they pulled the mask away. The entire courtroom gaped. Richard's world tilted, his stomach twisted, his vision blurred, because standing before him was someone he had believed to be gone forever, someone who should have been dead. "No," Richard whispered, stumbling back. That's not possible." But it was the man standing before him was Michael Reed, Richard's former business partner, a man he had betrayed, a man he had left for dead, a man who had just returned to finish what had been started. Richard staggered back, his face draining of all color. His mind refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. Michael Reed was dead, at least. That was what Richard had thought. That was what he had ensured. But there he was, standing in the middle of the courtroom, very much alive, and holding the proof that could ruin Richard forever. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Carter's sharp gaze flickered between Richard and Michael, taking in the tension that hung thick in the air. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice unwavering, "I was under the impression that you were deceased." Michael's lips curled into a humorless smile. That's what he wanted everyone to believe. His eyes locked onto Richard, filled with something dark and dangerous. "Isn't that right, Richard?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Michael was supposed to be gone. Buried silence. Judge turned to the security guards. "Bring him forward. I want to hear what he has to say." The guards moved to escort Michael toward the witness stand, but Richard snapped, "Absolutely not," he barked, slamming his hands on the table. "This man is a fraud, a liar. He has no right to be here." Judge Carter slowly turned to him, her eyes hardened. "Mr. Thornton, you do not dictate who speaks in my courtroom." Richard clenched his jaw so tight at her he had to regain control fast. He turned to his lawyer, hissing under his breath, "Do something." But even his lawyer looked rattled, defeated. Michael took his seat at the witness stand. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "For those of you who don't know, Richard and I used to be business partners." His voice was even, but there was fire beneath it. "We built Thornton Industries together, but Richard had other plans." Richard felt heat creep up his neck. Michael leaned forward. "Richard stole millions from the company, funneled it into offshore accounts, and then tried to pin it all on me." Gas echoed through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Richard could barely breathe. Michael continued, his voice razor sharp. "When I found out what he was doing, I confronted him. I told him I wouldn't let him get away with it, and that's when he tried to get rid of me." The jury's expression shifted from curiosity to horror. Judge Carter leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, are you saying that Mr. Thornton attempted to?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Kill me." "Yes." The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. People gasped in shock. The jury looked at each other, stunned. Richard's entire body locked up. This couldn't be happening. Michael turned to face him, his eyes burning with the weight of everything Richard had done. "You thought I was dead, didn't you?" Michael said quietly. "You thought you buried your secret forever." Richard's hands trembled beneath the table. Michael's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "You were wrong." Judge Carter's gavel slammed. "Order," she commanded. "I will have order in this courtroom." Slowly the murmurs died down, but the tension only grew thicker. Judge Carter exhaled, regaining control of the room. "Mr. Reed, do you have any evidence to support these allegations?" Michael turned toward the security guard, holding the USB drive. "Play it," he said. The judge nodded. "Clerk, please display the contents." The courtroom held its breath as the clerk inserted the USB into the monitor. The screen flickered to life. A video file. Richard's chest tightened, and then the video played, and what appeared on the screen made Richard's blood run cold. It was him, Richard, in his own office, and he was saying words that would destroy him. "Michael, you're getting in my way. People who get in my way disappear the exact moment." He had made the order to get rid of Michael. The entire courtroom exploded in shock, and Richard felt his empire collapse around him. Richard froze. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the gasps. The whispers and murmurs of shock that filled the courtroom, the video continued to play on the massive screen at the front of the room there. He was sitting in his office, swirling a glass of whiskey, as he spoke with calculated coldness. "Michael, you're getting in my way. People who get in my way disappear." Then a voice responded off camera, "What are you saying, Richard? Richard?" Watched in horror as his own past unraveled in front of him. "I'm saying," the Richard in the video said, leaning forward with a smirk, "that accidents happen. You should be careful." Michael, the video paused. The courtroom was dead silent. Every single I was on Richard. Even his own lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him, as if realizing for the first time who he was really defending. Judge Carter's face remained unreadable, but her fingers were clasped together, as if restraining herself from reacting. Richard's breathing was shallow, his fingers dug into the edge of the table. This wasn't just bad, this was the end. Michael turned toward him, and for the first time in the trial, Richard saw something in his former partner's eyes, satisfaction, pure unfiltered satisfaction. Michael had waited years for this moment, and now he had won. Judge Carter broke the silence. "Mr. Thornton," her voice was sharp, cutting like a blade, "would you like to explain yourself?" Richard's mouth was dry, his mind raced, searching desperately for an escape, a lie, anything that could undo what had just happened. He opened his mouth, and then the doors of the room slammed open. Boom, gas filled the air. A new figure stepped in, a woman dressed in a sleek dark suit, heels clicking sharply against the floor. As she walked with purpose, her cold gaze locked onto Richard. Immediately, Richard's stomach twisted violently. He knew who she was. FBI agent Olivia Hayes. Richard's world tilted. Judge Carter turned to her. "Agent Hayes, I assume you have urgent business here." Agent Hay gave a curt nod. "Yes, Your Honor. Apologies for the interruption, but this concerns Richard Thornton." The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Richard gritted his teeth. "This is ridiculous. I have no idea why the FBI is here." Agent Hayes stepped closer, pulling a folder from her bag and slapping it onto the plaintiff's table. "We've been building a case against Mr. Thornton for years. Money laundering, fraud, tax evasion." She turned toward him, eyes like steel. "But now, thanks to this video evidence, we have something even bigger." She paused, letting the silence sink. "In attempted murder." The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. The jury gasped in shock. The judge lifted a hand, demanding silence. Richard felt the walls closing, and this wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This wasn't about money. This was prison, real federal prison. Richard shot up from his seat. "This is outrageous. I built an empire. I am one of the most powerful men in this country." Agent Hayes didn't blink. She reached into her coat and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Not anymore," she said coldly. Then she nodded to the security guards. "Arrest him." The guards rushed forward. Richard's mind screamed this wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He tried to back away, but there was nowhere to run. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrist. The once untouchable Richard Thornton was now a prisoner. The last thing he saw before being dragged away was Michael Reed standing tall, watching him fall. And for the first time in Richard's life, he knew what it felt like to lose. Richard's wrist burned as the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around him. His breath came in short, erratic bursts. The courtroom around him swirled in chaos. Reporters shouting, camera flashes blinding, and murmurs growing into a deafening roar. Judge Carter banged her gavel. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." The noise dimmed, but Richard barely registered it. His mind race, grasping at any escape, any loophole that could save him. This couldn't be happening. He was Richard Thornton, a king in the world of business, a man above the law. And now he was being dragged away like a criminal. Michael Reed stood motionless, watching him with cold, quiet victory. Hannah Lawson, the woman Richard had thought was nothing more than an insignificant speck, sat tall at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded, unshaken. Judge Carter leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thornton, you are officially being remanded into federal custody, pending a full investigation into these charges." Richard's pulse pounded. His lawyer, his useless, spineless lawyer, sat frozen mouth. "Agape, this wasn't over. It couldn't be over." He jerked against the officers restraining him. "This is a setup." He roared, "I am innocent. You hear me, innocent." But no one looked convinced. The jury members had already decided. The courtroom was full of hungry reporters, knowing they had just witnessed the fall of a giant. And then Judge Carter said something that made Richard's blood turn to ice. "Bail is denied." His stomach plummeted. No bail, no chance to fight from the outside. He felt the world collapse around him. The guards pulled him forward, but he resisted, twisting violently. "You can't do this." He bellowed, his voice shaking with pure rage. "I built this city. I own the judges, the politicians. I own this court." Judge Carter's face remain stoic. That is where you are mistaken. Mr. Thornton, her voice was calm yet deadly. Because today the law owns you, and with those words, everything changed. The guards hauled him toward the exit. He thrashed wildly, refusing to accept defeat. But then he locked eyes with Michael one last time. Michael smiled. Not a cruel, gloating smile, a relieved one, a smile that said justice had finally been served, and for the first time in Richard Thornton's life, he realized he was truly alone. The doors slammed shut behind him 48 hours later. Richard sat in a tiny, cold cell. The walls were gray, the air was stale, the flickering overhead light buzzed like an insect. This wasn't his penthouse office. This wasn't his $1,000,000 home. This was prison. He stared at the metal door in front of him. No assistants, no lawyers, no power, just silence. Just then the door creaked open. A guard stepped inside. Thornton knew he got a visitor. Richard's breath hitched. A visitor. Someone was finally coming to get him out. His connections were still alive. His money still held power. He sat up, hands clenched in anticipation, but when the guard stepped aside, his heart stopped, because standing there was Hannah Lawson, his former employee, the woman he had ruined, the woman who had ruined him. She stepped inside, arms crossed, looking down at him like a man who had already lost. Richard's chest burned with rage. "Why are you here?" Hannah didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a seat across from him, calm, steady, unafraid. Then in the quietest voice she said, "You once told me that the weak don't survive. In your world." Richard's jaw tightened. Hannah leaned forward. "But look at you now." Richard, her voice was soft, almost pitying. "Who's the weak one now?" Richard shook with fury. Hannah stood, her eyes never leaving his. "Enjoy your time here." She turned to leave. Richard lunged forward, yanking at his cuffs. "You think this is over? I will come back. I will rebuild everything. You will all regret this." Hannah paused at the door, then without looking back, she simply said, "No. Richard, you won't." And with that, she walked away. The door slammed shut. Richard Thor was finally powerless, and for the first time in his life, he had no way out. Richard sat in silence. The metal chair beneath him was hard and cold. His wrists burned from the tight handcuffs. His breath came in ragged gasps, his entire body shaking with rage. Hannah's words echoed in his head. "No, Richard, you won't." The moment the door had slammed shut behind her, something inside Richard had snapped. This wasn't real. It could be. He was Richard Thornton. He had built an empire. He had bought power. He had controlled everything, and now he was locked away like a common criminal, his hands clenched into fists. No, he wouldn't accept this. There was still a way out. There was always a way out. He just had to find it. 2 weeks later, the sound of clanging metal filled the air as Richard was led down a long, dimly lit hallway. The guards gripped his arms tightly, guiding him toward a small, enclosed meeting room. Richard's face was unshaven, his hair disheveled. He had spent the last 2 weeks trapped in a tiny concrete cell, eating food that barely passed as edible, surrounded by men who didn't fear him. But none of that mattered, because today he was finally getting what he needed. His lawyer was here. They entered the room, and Richard's lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, was already waiting, briefcase neatly placed on the table in front of him. Jonathan adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. The guard shoved Richard into the chair before stepping back, standing watch. Near the door, Richard leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Tell me you have good news," he said, voice low. Jonathan hesitated. That wasn't a good sign. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of legal documents. "Richard," he began, voice measured, "you need to understand something. The situation, it's bad." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't need a lecture, Jonathan. I need a way out." Jonathan exhaled. "That's the problem. There isn't one." A slow, burning rage curled inside Richard's chest. "There's always a way out," he growled. "We have money, connections. Pull some strings to your job." Jonathan's eyes flickered with frustration. "That's just it, Richard. Your money frozen, your connections jumping ship. The board of Thornton Industries just announced that they're officially removing you from the company." Richard's breath caught, his fingers dug into the table. "No, that's not possible. They wouldn't dare." Jonathan slid a document across the table. Richard's stomach dropped when he saw the headline, "Thornton Industries severs all ties with fallen CEO, new leadership to be announced." His hands trembled. This couldn't be happening. Jonathan continued, "They've distanced themselves entirely. No one wants to be associated with you. The stock is rebounding now that you're gone. Investors are relieved." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He had been erased. His empire, his reputation, his legacy, all of it gone. He gritted his teeth. No, he wouldn't go down like this. He lifted his chin, masking his panic. "Fine, I don't need the company. Will fight the charges in court. Will." Jonathan slammed another document onto the table. Richard blinked. It was a plea deal, a deal for 20 years in prison. Richard's heart nearly stopped. Jonathan's voice was firm. "The prosecutors have enough evidence to bury you for life. Right now, they're offering 20 years if you plead guilty, if you fight this and lose." Jonathan's expression darkened your never-getting-out Richard felt like he was drowning, his fingernails dug into his palms 20 years. He'd be old, weak, forgotten. His voice came out like a whisper. I can't do this." Jonathan leaned forward. "This is your only shot, Richard. Take the deal or spend the rest of your life behind bars." Richard's head spun, his breath came in short gasps. This was real. There was no secret way out, no last-minute safe, no miracle. He had lost everything: his company, his wealth, his power. And soon his freedom, his hand shook as he stared at the papers. For the first time in his life, Richard Thornton was trapped in no amount of money, manipulation, or arrogance could save him. Now Richard stared at the plea deal, the black ink on the paper, feeling like a death sentence. 20 years, 20 years. In prison, his hands trembled, his breathing was uneven. The reality sinking in like a blade to the gut. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a setback. This was the end. Across the table, Jonathan Pierce watched him with a neutral expression. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet finality, the kind that said this was over. Richard swallowed hard, his mind raced. There had to be another way. There was always another way. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so the guards wouldn't hear Jonathan. He said, forcing his tone to remain steady, "I need you to do something for me." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Richard's fingers dug into the table. "I need you to contact some of my friends." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. Richard stopped. Richard ignored him. "I need offshore accounts, reopened lawyers, bought a few key witnesses." Jonathan slammed his briefcase shut. Richard flinched. His lawyer's voice was sharp, cold. "Richard," Jonathan said, exasperated, "you still don't get it, do you?" Richard's jaw tightened. "You think this is still a game that you can manipulate or scare your way out of this? But let me be clear, you're done." Richard's pulse spiked. "I can still know you can't." Jonathan's eyes hardened. "The government has frozen your accounts. Your former allies are testifying against you to save themselves. Even the people you thought were loyal, they're cutting deals." Richard's breath hitched. He clenched his fists under the table. Jonathan leaned in, voice quiet but merciless. "You're not powerful anymore, Richard. You're just another criminal in a cage." Richard's entire body tined. The burning rage inside him threatened to explode. He wasn't just another criminal. He was Richard Thornton, and Richard Thornton never lost. He forced a smirk, though it felt hollow. "So that's it," he said, feigning nonchalance. "You're giving up on me." Jonathan sighed, standing up and gathering his files. "I'm not giving up," he said simply. "I'm just accepting reality." Richard's smirk vanished. Jonathan slid the plea deal across the table. "You have one choice left, Richard. Sign this or spend the rest of your life in a cell." Richard's chest tightened. He looked down at the papers. The words blurred together. 20 years. No more empire. No more power. No more Richard Thornton. He slowly reached for the pen, and then the alarms blared. A loud, deafening siren filled the air, followed by the rapid slamming of metal doors. Jonathan froze. The guards outside the door immediately reached for their radios. "What the hell?" Jonathan started. But before he could finish, the lights flickered, then darkness. The power went out. Richard's heart pounded. Something was wrong. Then a single red emergency light flickered on, casting the room in an eerie glow. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Lockdown, lockdown. All prisoners to their cells immediately." Jonathan stiffened. The guards exchanged worried glances. Richard's mind raced. A prison riot, an escape attempt, whatever it this was his chance. He wasn't going to rot in here. He was getting out no matter what it took. The red emergency light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The blaring siren screamed through the prison, shaking the walls with its relentless noise. Richard's pulse thundered. This was it, his chance. Chaos was the perfect cover across from him. Jonathan Pierce looked stunned, his hands hovering over the plea deal Richard had been moments away from signing. "What the hell is happening?" Jonathan muttered. The guards at the door tined, gripping their radios. "Control, this is Bravo Unit." And holding, "What's the situation?" One of them barked into his walkie-talkie. The radio crackled a burst of static. Then riot in cell block. "See multiple inmates loose, locked down." Initiated. Jonathan's face piled. A riot. The guard nearest to Richard cursed under his breath, then turned toward him. "This meeting is over. We're taking him back to his cell." Boom. A loud crash shook the building. It was followed by shouts, the sound of metal bars clanking, and panicked screams. Richard's mind spun. He needed to act fast. He watched the guards calculating. They were distracted and nervous. For the first time since he had been arrested, Richard had the upper hand. Seconds later, Richard moved fast. Before the closest guard could react, Richard lunged, twisting his body and ramming his shoulders straight into his chest. The guard stumbled back, caught off guard. The second guard reacted, reaching for his baton. But Richard kicked the table, sending it crashing into him. Jonathan shouted, "Richard, what the hell are you doing?" Richard didn't answer. His survival instincts had kicked in. The first guard recovered, grabbing Richard by the shoulders. But Richard twisted violently, using his cuffed hands to slam the guard's face into the table. The man collapsed. The second guard was still pinned under the fallen table, struggling. Richard saw his key ring. This was his chance. He dropped to his knees, snatching the keys, and fumbled with his cuffs. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to focus. Jonathan's voice was frantic. "Are you insane? You can't escape from here." Richard ignored him. One click, the cuff snapped open. His wrists were free. Jonathan stared at him, eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," Richard straightened, rolling his sore wrists. "I'm not spending the next 20 years in a cage," he said coldly. Then he turned toward the door. It was still locked, but not for long. He flipped through the key ring, his heartbeat hammering. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Guards were coming. He had seconds. Richard found the right key, jammed it into the lock. The door swung open, and just as he stepped through, a prisoner appeared. Wild eyes, a bloody nose, a sharpened piece of metal clenched in his fist. Richard barely had time to react before the man lunged. The shiv slashed through the air. Richard jerked back, barely dodging the blade, missed his throat by inches. The prisoner's face was twisted with rage. "You think you're better than us, Thornton," he snarled. "You rich boys don't belong in here." Richard had no time to argue. The prisoner lunged again. Richard moved instinctively. He sidestepped, grabbing the prisoner's wrist mid-swing, then asterisk with brutal force, asterisk. He slammed the man's head against the door frame.